get a little philosophical for a bit here on today's show because over the weekend, my brother was going back and forth with a work colleague about individual rights and the role of government and so forth, which, by the way, I was so proud of him for some of the arguments that he was making. But it really struck in me a reminder of how little Americans really understand about what individual rights really are and how they're derived, which is so important, so crucial for every American to understand at this point in time when we are looking at questions of civil liberty abounding right now over the coronavirus pandemic. So who better to talk to than the president of Speakeasy Ideas, a constitutional scholar, a former professor, and the director of the Defenders of the Declaration program at the Leadership Program of the Rockies, Tom Krannawitter. Dr. Tom Krannawitter, PhD, joins us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Sir, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Hey, Jimmy, how are you? Thank you for having me.
You know, I'm doing very well. And before we jump in, I want to ask you a two-part question. One, how are you doing amidst everything? And two, tell us a little bit about Speakeasy Ideas. Give you a chance to fill us in.
Speakeasy Ideas is my business that I founded after a career in the academic world. And it's all about ideas. It's about taking the most important ideas, packaging them up, bundling them, presenting them in ways that are useful for ordinary citizens. I mean, it turns out ideas are the most valuable things, the most important things in the world, and getting the ideas right is really everything, because there are incredibly beautiful, helpful, useful ideas like the idea of individual freedom, the idea of property, the idea of the rule of law. These all begin as ideas. There are also terrible ideas out there. Karl Marx, for example, offered all kinds of ideas that led to the most murderous regimes in the world. So we want to make sure and get the ideas right, which is what we do at Speakeasy Ideas.
And let's jump into a critical idea, as I set up, the notion of individual rights, because you ask people a lot, what are rights? What are your rights? And they may list off some examples. We've got a right to free speech, a right to freedom of religion, we've got freedom of the press, and list those off. Or they may say we've got a right to health care and education, right, so on and so forth. But some of those are examples of rights, others are counter to the idea of what an individual right actually is. So let's source it for us. First, what is an individual right and where does it derive from?
An individual right is a synonym for an individual natural freedom. If it's a kind of freedom that you have by nature, so you have the freedom by nature to think, right? Your thoughts are yours. You have a right to your thoughts, your opinions. By nature, you have the freedom to speak. You have the freedom to move around. You have the freedom to use your mind to direct your hands to produce things and create things. So you have a right to your property, to the things you create. Individual rights, properly understood, is a synonym for individual freedom, for natural freedom. If you want to know what you have a right to, just ask yourself, what kind of freedoms do you have by your nature? And here I want to sort of tell a story of rights in American history and summarize a big topic in a short period of time. This country was founded on the idea of individual natural rights, right? Natural freedoms. Our freedom, our right to speak, to think, to worship God as we want, to our own property, to associate with our friends and people who want to associate with us. In the course of the 1930s and the 1940s, think of the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal programs. He introduced a new idea into American politics. He said, those rights in the founding, those were great for back then, and we still want to protect them. Here was the interesting thing about Franklin Roosevelt. He never derided the founders. He never criticized them. He didn't challenge them. He said those rights were absolutely the proper thing for the problems they had in their day. And the problem they had in their day was the problem of political tyranny, government tyranny, right? We had a king back then who wanted to send armies and navies over and do all sorts of terrible things. So this was FDR's thesis. When a people are suffering from political tyranny, the solution it comes in the form of political rights. Political rights solves the problem of political tyranny. So political rights like the right to consent to our government, the right to speak, the right to newspapers to publish freely, all those sort of things. FDR then said, but in the 1930s, our problem, our threat is no longer a political tyranny. Our government is benign. Our government loves us. Our government is staffed with people that we sent there and we selected. And so tyranny comes in a different form, he said, in the 1940s. It comes from big businesses, from big corporations. It's economic tyranny. What FDR introduced to Americans in the 1930s and 40s is this idea that the new form of tyranny comes, it is economic tyrannies, big businesses who are going to determine the conditions of our work and how we live, how we play. And he said the solution to economic tyranny comes in the form of economic rights, meaning rights to things like the right to a house, the right to a job, the right to a certain minimum wage, the right to health care, the rights to economic goods and services. And as he presented this in the 1930s, he said there is no conflict between this new style of economic rights, right to a house, right to health care, right to a minimum wage, and the old-fashioned natural rights, the right to free speech, the right to religious liberty, the right to one's own property. He said they fit together. And when he said that, he wasn't telling the truth, because they don't fit together. You see this in the very obvious fact, if one person has a right to, say, a house, and the person doesn't have a house, but he says, I have a rightful claim to a house, well, that means someone else needs to provide a house. Someone has to buy a house, build a house, produce a house. In other words, government is going to have to take somebody's property to give this person a house. The government's going to have to take property from some to provide health care, right? To hire physicians and nurses for somebody else. Every economic right requires violating the property rights, the natural rights of some. And this goes farther. We see this in modern socialist and communist tyrannies.
I just really want to get to unpacking one thing that you kept talking about, which is natural rights and how property and the ability to speak, being free to think, free to act, free to choose, are all natural rights. Define natural rights for just a moment. Just go back to underscoring the point of why it's natural and not something that's just given to us by government.
So a natural right is inherent in human nature. That's why it's a natural right. And so the way to understand this is to think about what a human being is by nature. What is human nature? If you look at human beings, right, they differ in a number of ways. We differ in size and height and skin color, hair color, eye color. We differ in levels of intelligence. There's all kinds of diversity among human beings in many ways. And we all have certain things in common. Every human being is part material, meaning a physical body, right? And some people have more attractive looking physical bodies than some of us, but we all have a physical body. We have skin and hair and bones and blood. We're matter, we're material, and we are something else. There's a part of us that is immaterial, that is metaphysical. Some folks call that a soul. Some folks call it a mind, a free mind. Whatever word you want to give it or label, there is something, there's a part of us that is metaphysically free. And what I mean by metaphysically free, I mean not determined by the laws of physics, right? Metaphysically free, that's the mind that is free to choose, free to think, free to contemplate, reflect, and make choices. So my nature is the nature of a being that I have a physical body that is the home to a metaphysical mind. My nature, therefore, nature indicates that my mind should govern my body. Your mind should govern your body. The very idea of self-government is woven right into our nature. Each of us has a right, it is rightful for each of us to govern ourselves. The entire criminal code, think of all criminal laws. The premise is that each person's mind is responsible for what each person's body does, right? Our mind and body should go together. I choose what to do with my body, which is why if I choose to assault someone or steal something, well, the criminal law holds me accountable because my mind governs my body. I have a rightful claim to govern myself. I have a rightful claim to make choices for myself. I have a natural right to live freely, to pursue happiness, right, in the way that I see best fit. This rightful claim, this natural right, is not a gift from any government. It's not a gift from any bureaucrat. It does not depend on any law. In fact, just the opposite.
Dr. Tom Krannawitter, our guest, let me say something and ask you this. And we got him frozen up again, but I think he'll pop back here. Tom Krannawitter, again, is president of Speakeasy Ideas. And one thing that's important to really get at when we're talking about the issue of natural rights is the point that he was making before about economic rights being essentially trampling upon this mythical idea of economic rights trampling upon natural rights. Tom Krannawitter, apologies for not sure what's been going on today with these connection issues, but can you take us to the next step, which is, because I think you laid out natural rights very well, but then go back to the idea of the conflict of economic rights and natural rights, and the idea that if you are forcing, say, a doctor to provide healthcare services, or you are forcing somebody who is you're forcing somebody else to do something or to provide some sort of a good or service, that means you're taking away their natural rights.
Yeah, that's right. Every economic right requires the violation of somebody's natural rights. And a moment before we got disconnected here through the interwebs, I had started to talk about the history of socialist and communist nations. Mm-hmm. Every one of them begins with these promises of economic goods, economic rights. They begin with socialists promising free healthcare, free medicine, right, free housing, free education. Says everybody has a right to these things. And then millions of people, they nod their head and they say, okay, we agree. We'll support you in your power in government if you give us all this free stuff. Now, all of a sudden, the political class has a huge problem on their hand. That is, how do we deliver all this stuff? Government does not have, armies of teachers and physicians. It doesn't have houses and cars and computers and all these things that they promised to give away. So how are those in government going to deliver all these things they promised? They have to start controlling and commanding.
Here's a reason why I wanted to go over the natural rights question and the notion of individual rights. And that is because here right now, in the middle of this coronavirus crisis, people are not paying attention and do not know and understand what their rights are. And the notion that it's not just we are given certain rights, but we have natural rights, and that these are not to be subjugated by government in order to provide so-called economic rights to others. And it's a critical point, and also a critical point to keep in mind when we're talking about power. The power structure here, where government is able to force certain things, force these shutdowns and what have you. And we need to keep in mind and understand and know what the nature of individual rights are. So it looks like here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, via the telephone, we now have Dr. Tom Krannawitter. Tom, can you hear me okay, my friend?
Jimmy, I am, and I'm feeling very retro being I'm not only on a phone, I'm on a phone with a cord connected to it. How about
Whoa! That? This is like, are you from was that like 1800s kind of stuff, or is that a little too soon here for what's going on?
That's right. Well, Abraham Lincoln invented the telephone, didn't he?
Yes, just like Al Gore invented the internet. So that's exactly
right.
Exactly right happened. So here's what I was just kind of saying there where we were getting you on is why I think it's important we're talking about this natural right discussion. So very briefly, why don't you encapsulate the points that you've made, and then we can expand from there.
So the most fundamental rights, the first rights, the most important rights for human flourishing are individual natural rights. And it's an old-fashioned term. We don't use it much anymore, natural rights. And what it means these rights are inherent in our nature. When I say natural rights, it's a synonym for individual freedom, the things you have the freedom to do by nature. What can you do by your nature? You can think, you can speak, you can walk around, you can use your hands and make things and do things. Those are the things you have natural rights to. You don't have a natural right. You have no rightful claim to someone else's person, to someone else's body, to someone else's labor. So anything that requires another human being. So a house, right, requires other people to build it. Healthcare requires physicians and nurses and medical technicians to do all kinds of things. One cannot have a rightful claim, one cannot have a right to healthcare or to a house or to an education, because one doesn't have a rightful claim to the person and the property and the labor of other people. We have a natural right, a rightful claim by nature to what is ours by nature. And what is ours by nature is our body, our mind, and our labor. That's what we have a natural right to.
And so when that comes into conflict with government decisions on providing certain economic rights or restricting certain kinds of activities, how do you balance that? I mean, the basic idea in my mind is, look, we have a criminal justice system specifically because if I violate your rights by assaulting you or harming you or stealing something from you, that means that I have trampled upon your individual rights, and therefore government exists to intervene at that point in time or to protect your property and what have you. But then we get to a point where they start saying, no, we need to have government do a little bit more. Maybe we need government to shut down certain businesses. We need to quarantine certain individuals. We need maybe certificates of immunity for people to walk around, as Anthony Fauci has floated as a possible idea that the government's considering, and what have you. These are instances where government policies can come into direct conflict with individual natural rights.
Yeah, in fact, you put your finger on something really important here. When we have a politics based on natural rights, that is the politics of the Declaration of Independence, the politics that emerged out of the American Revolution, then the law is used to punish injustice, right? So say the criminal code you just mentioned, the law punishes people who steal or assault others or murder others or do things like that, right? The law is in the service of justice by punishing injustice. However, the moment we start to adopt a politics of economic rights, once Americans start to agree, yeah, we think we have a right to health care, and we have a right to a house, and we have a right to education, then all of a sudden we change the nature of law. Law, rather than being on the side of justice, law starts to be used for injustice. We start to legalize taking property from some people in order to transfer it to other people. And that's the terrible situation we're in right now. We have a very confused kind of politics because on the one hand, many Americans think that they do have a right to their own property, and they want the laws to protect their property. And they're right. They do have a right to their own property. And many of those same Americans in the next breath will say, and I think people have a right to health care. Well, for government to provide health care, it's going to have to take property. It's going to have to violate the property rights of many in order to offer it to others. And this points to one of these fundamental core concepts that when you first hear it, it almost seems boring. It seems trivial. It seems uninteresting, and yet so many Americans don't get it. And that is the fact that government creates no wealth at all, zero wealth. If we really think about what wealth is, and I want to distinguish, I'm not talking about money, right? Money is a currency, cash, right? They can turn on the printing presses and print more money. That's not the same as wealth. Real wealth, meaning things that you can have that other people value, that other people are willing to pay for or trade for. It could be physical items that you have. It could be talent. It could be knowledge. It could be skills that you have that other people value. That's wealth. How is wealth created? Wealth is created when a person gets off his butt and uses his brain and uses his hands and does something that other people value, right? So if I build a house and others want a house, they're willing to pay for a house, I've created wealth for myself by doing something that other people value. Now think about government. Government has three basic powers, right? Everyone learns this as a kid. Legislative power, executive power, judicial power. That's why the government is divided into three branches. What is the legislative power? It's the power to pass laws. And what do most laws do? Laws are commandments that typically say thou shalt not. It's some kind of restriction, some kind of prohibition. The executive power is the power to enforce those laws, to make sure that people are not doing whatever the law says they're not supposed to do. And the judicial power is the power to judge when there are accusations that some people have violated the laws. They have to sit and judge, did this person actually violate the law? In that whole process of government, making laws, enforcing laws, and judging whether laws have been violated, zero wealth is created. Computers are not built, food is not grown, medicines are not invented, houses are not designed. The things that we value aren't being created by government. So when government says, we'll supply you food, or we'll supply you with health care, we'll supply your medicines, the government has to take that from somebody. Right. And that's why every promise, every entitlement, every economic right promised by government requires violating the natural rights, the property rights of others.
So Dr. Tom Krannawitter, our guest, president of Speakeasy Ideas, just a few minutes left with you. Talk about individual rights in your view in the context of the coronavirus pandemic that we're seeing right now with various restrictions predominantly placed by the states as opposed to the federal government. President Trump has, notwithstanding his comment a couple of days ago about total authority, which he's clarified, he has basically said the states, using general police powers, have the authority to do these quarantines and economic shutdowns, that he hasn't moved forward with it himself nationally and is unlikely to force a reopening himself, but states have taken it upon themselves. And individual rights are still important, whether it's a state or federal government. State governments just have a little bit more authority directly over the people with general police powers, for example, than the federal government. But what do you make of individual rights in the COVID era?
Well, so, it's an interesting thing. There's so many things there that you just brought up. Yeah. It's a fascinating thing, that whole constitutional question of national power versus states' power. Mm-hmm. And you are right constitutionally. You nailed it dead on that. The national government does not have those general police powers. Those are reserved to the states. And so it really is Trump was mistaken constitutionally when he said he has total power. However, there's this wrinkle, there's this interesting rub. When states and cities and other organizations start crawling on their knees to the government, begging for funding for everything, all of a sudden, this is not a constitutional question. This is just a question of leverage and dependency, right? You can't be dependent on someone to feed you and be independent from their control. And so that's the tough situation states are finding themselves in. Yes, states have this constitutional latitude that the national government does not. However, the states also receive all kinds of funding and grants from the federal government, which gives the federal government all kinds of extra constitutional power and influence over states to really dictate what the states may and may not do. In terms of individual rights, look, the government, those in government, if they want to listen to medical experts and listen to mathematical modelers, and then they think they have some advice to offer to citizens, they are perfectly free to offer that advice and say, here's what we think would help you be safer, healthier, better protected. But in the end, their job is to protect our freedom, our natural right to govern ourselves. It is not to be our lords. It is not to be our parents, and that is the kind of role that many governors and state legislators are assuming. We are seeing a complete violation of individual rights. In fact, I suspect, from people like Dr. Fauci up there at the national level to many governors across the country right now, it's become clear that this idea of individual rights is not even on their radar. This is not something they think about. This is not something that concerns them. What they think that their populations, the populations around them, that these are social engineering experiments, and they'll decide where people can and cannot go, when they can go, what they may or may not do. It's the opposite of a government designed to protect individual rights.
Well, Tom Krannawitter, let me ask you this, and that is, when it comes to individual rights, obviously there are infringements that we're seeing. However, at the same time, the counter-argument may be, if I get the coronavirus because you have it and you were irresponsible and reckless, and then I get the virus and then I die, you put my life, my right to life at risk, and ultimately that took my right to life. And therefore, the idea of taking these steps for public health is in pursuit of the fundamental right to life that we are all entitled to, and therefore some government actions are appropriate. You say what, Dr. Tom Krannawitter?
I say that if I come and, if I assault you, Jimmy, and I bind you down, and I know that I have coronavirus, and I purposefully, cough and sneeze all over you to give you this virus, I clearly, the criminal law can rightfully punish me for doing that. But each of us has a natural right and a natural responsibility, a natural duty to take care of ourselves, to protect ourselves, to defend ourselves best that we can. So when there are dangers out in the world, such as communicable diseases, and we need to remember there have been, there are, and there always will be many other communicable diseases other than COVID-19 and coronavirus. Knowing that that's out there, free citizens have the freedom to take whatever measures they want to protect themselves. I'll give you an example. My parents neither of them are young, neither of them are in great health, and they live in another state, and I was supposed to visit them a few weeks ago. So I called them, and I said, I don't think I have this. I don't feel sick, but I know that people can carry this virus without symptoms, and I don't want to bring this to you guys. I don't want to get you sick. And they agreed. They thanked me. They said, let's just hold off on that visit until things seem to settle down and it seems safer. We made a decision. They have chosen. They're hardly ever leaving their house. They're basically, isolating themselves because they're free, responsible citizens. That's the model right there of what citizens should do. If I run my business, which I'm doing right now, that doesn't threaten you. That doesn't violate your rights. You are free to do whatever you choose to do to protect yourself and take care of yourself. But your right to take care of yourself grants to you no authority, and that includes if you're sitting in a governor's chair. It grants to you no authority to command everyone else to stop the work of life by threat of punishment or being thrown in jail.
Dr. Tom Krannawitter, there are a lot of different directions I could take that, but instead, here's what I want to do to wrap things up. You mentioned Dr. Anthony Fauci before. I want to play a clip. This is him on Friday in an interview with CNN's Allison Camerata in the morning on Friday, where he talked about the idea of basically Americans having to potentially walk around with papers demonstrating immunity to the novel coronavirus.
People.
Can you imagine a time where Americans carry certificates of immunity?
That's possible. I mean, it's one of those things that we talk about when we want to make sure that we know who the vulnerable people are and not. This is something that's being discussed. I think it might actually have some merit under certain circumstances.
Okay.
It seems like he was trying to weave his way around that, but it might have some merit in some circumstances. I mean, when I heard that, I was like, the civil libertarian in me was like, whoa, hold on, Dr. Fauci, no way.
You're right, and let me offer the counter model, the counter model of free self-governing citizens. The counter model would be citizens decide what they want to do for themselves, and I can imagine someone saying, hey, I am at high risk, so I am going to stay in my house most of the time. And if you want to come into my house for any reason, even as a friend, you have to show me papers that you're immune, and otherwise you're not invited in. I could imagine people doing that with their own businesses,
Sure.
which is their property. if they wanted to, if they want to say, hey, before you walk in the door of my business, you have to show proof that you're immune. Someone can do that with their own property, and then they get to choose with whom do they want to associate. I can choose what businesses I want to go into, and right, and what friends I want to go see or invite over to my house. That's the freedom model, rather than the government, right, requiring that everyone go get these tests and carry around papers as if we're back in Germany in the 1930s.
Yeah, I think that is well put about the difference between how a free society would handle this notion of certificates of immunity versus the prospect. And this is what I think Fauci and Camerata both had in mind of the government mandating that kind of certification. Dr. Tom Krannawitter, thanks so much for your extensive time today, as well as powering through some of these technical issues. You know, you never know what will happen when you're doing live streaming, and I appreciate it, and certainly do encourage folks to check you out at speakeasyideas.com.
Thank you, Jimmy. Have a great rest of your day. I appreciate it.
Thank you. You as well. Stay healthy and well. Again, Dr. Tom Krannawitter joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Well, that is it.